In medieval Londres, people lived less than a metre from their own waste. The smell was permanent. The river that fed the city was the same one that received everything it discarded. Blood from butcher shops, waste from tanneries, excrement from hundreds of thousands of human bodies. The water one drank and the water that killed came from the same place, and no one saw a problem with that. It was simply the condition of urban life. It was simply Londres. To understand how such a city came to exist and why people not only tolerated these conditions but actively chose them over rural life, we need to go back much further than the Londres most imagine. We need to go to the foundations. Popular imagination paints medieval Londres as a setting of widespread poverty, superstition, and constant suffering. The reality recorded in manuscripts, parish records, and archaeological excavations reveals something more complex and more disturbing. A city that, by the standards of its time, was extraordinarily functional, surprisingly wealthy, and, in almost every measurable aspect, one of the most desired places to live in the Atlantic world. By the mid-12th century, Londres was the largest city in Inglaterra by a margin that had no comparison. Its population revolved around 25,000 people, a number that would triple over the next 100 years. The Tamisa was not just a river, it was the backbone of a commercial network that connected the city to Flandre, to Geneva, to the Liga Hanseatica, and, through indirect routes, to the Muslim world and beyond. Flemish merchants landed bales of processed wool at the wharves on the north bank. Hanseatic traders brought amber from the Baltic, salted fish from the North Atlantic, and wood from Nordic forests. Wines from the Reno and Bordeaux circulated through the warehouses along the riverbanks. Londres was not the end of the world, it was one of its points of convergence. The Ponte de Londres was, in this context, an organism unto itself, built of stone around the year 1176, after centuries of wooden bridges that caught fire or collapsed regularly. It was about 270 meters long and supported by 19 arches. On it were houses, shops, a chapel dedicated to St. Thomas Becket, and a mill powered by the current passing under the arches. There were, at certain times, the decapitated heads of traitors stuck on poles above the gatehouse tower. The bridge was simultaneously infrastructure, a commercial neighborhood, a place of worship, and an instrument of political power. It was, in short, the city in miniature, functional, dense, contradictory, and brutal. Life within the Roman walls, which still delimited the core of the city, was organized in a way that generated efficiency and suffocation in equal proportions. The main streets were wide enough for 2 wagons to pass side by side, but the alleys that branched off from them could be less than 1.5 meters wide. The upper floors of the wooden houses jutted out over the street at each level, so that the roofs almost touched. Sunlight reached ground level for only a few hours, depending on the season. The floor of these alleys was a composition of mud, rotting straw, horse manure, human waste, and residue from the trades practiced nearby. There was no separation between workspace, living space, and disposal space. A butcher threw animal remains directly into the street. A tanner poured the fluids from the process, fermented urine, animal fat, tannin, into the gutters that ran alongside the houses toward the river. The odors were not occasional. They were the permanent, inescapable environment, accepted as a normal condition of urban existence, and yet people came. They came from the fields, they came from smaller towns, they came from neighboring countries, because Londres offered something the countryside could not: possibility. The structure of the gildas, the craft corporations that controlled every branch of commercial and artisanal activity within the city, guaranteed protection, training, access to markets, and, for those who reached the top, considerable wealth. A blacksmith's apprentice who arrived in Londres at age 12 could, in theory, become a master blacksmith at 25, and accumulate enough property to guarantee the livelihood of his family for generations. This possibility, even when rarely realized, was enough to maintain the constant flow of migrants toward the city. The guilders were not just economic institutions, they were complete systems of social order. They regulated prices, they regulated product quality, they regulated who could work in which trade and under what conditions. A baker who sold bread below the prescribed weight could be dragged through the streets on a sledge with the bread hanging around his neck as public punishment. A merchant who adulterated wine with water was forced to drink the mixture until he vomited in the square. These punishments were not just institutionalized cruelty, they were the quality control system of an economy without a central regulator. And they worked. The markets of Londres had a reputation for consistency that attracted buyers from all over the south of Inglaterra. Obedience guaranteed access, disobedience meant exclusion. Religion structured time in a way that has no direct equivalent in the contemporary world. It was not a weekly practice, it was the rhythm of the day. The bells of more than 100 parish churches inside and immediately outside the walls marked the canonical hours. Matinas before dawn, prima at sunrise, terza, sexta, noa, vesperas at sunset, completas before bed. A medieval Londoner did not say, "It's 2 in the afternoon." They said, "After the noa." Time was sacred because it belonged to God, and the Church was the administrator of God's time. This does not mean that medieval Londoners lived in a state of permanent mystical contemplation. Parish records and ecclesiastical court trials reveal a much more mundane picture. There was systematic drunkenness in the taverns, establishments that functioned as hybrids of a bar, inn, social club, and place of business. There was gambling. There was organized prostitution, tolerated and, in certain areas like Southwark, on the south side of the Ponte de Londres, and outside the direct jurisdiction of the city, openly licensed by the Bishopric of Winchester. The brothels of Southwark were called, with an irony that time has not erased, as Galinas do Bispo. Violence was frequent and close. Not the spectacular violence of battles, that was the violence of the nobility, staged in fields outside the city. The everyday violence of Londres was more banal, tavern brawls that ended in stabbings, boundary disputes between neighbors that escalated into physical aggression, corporal punishments carried out in public in market squares. The law arrived after the fact. The sheriff and his officers tried to maintain order, but the walls enclosed a population that grew faster than any administrative structure could absorb. Public health was a contradiction in terms. The municipal authorities of Londres developed, throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, a set of sanitary regulations that were, for the time, remarkably detailed. There were specific prohibitions against throwing waste into the streets during certain hours. There were orders for butchers to remove waste from their establishments at set intervals. There were municipal officials appointed to inspect and fine violators. Records show that these regulations existed. Those same records show they were violated with a consistency that suggests practically zero compliance. The problem was not a lack of institutional will, it was mathematics. A city that grew from 25,000 to 80,000 inhabitants in less than 2 centuries. In a territory physically delimited by Roman walls and the river, had no way to maintain the ratio between population and disposal infrastructure. Every new house built was a new source of waste. Every new artisan established was a new point of contamination. The Temesa received everything and returned part of it during high tides, when the river rose and flooded the waterfront streets with a mixture of river water and sewage. The city grew against itself. Infant mortality was the brutal filter that shaped the surviving population. It is estimated that between 1/3 and 1/2 of children born in medieval Londres died before completing 5 years of age. The causes were multiple. Diarrhea caused by contaminated water, Respiratory infections accelerated by the permanent smoke from fireplaces in enclosed environments, domestic accidents in spaces without adequate supervision, and the recurring epidemics that swept the city with a regularity that made any long-term plan a gamble. Death was not an exceptional event in medieval Londres. It was a constant presence, incorporated into the religious calendar, economic daily life, and the emotional architecture of every family. The cemeteries were inside the city, around the churches, separated from the houses by little more than a wooden fence. In normal periods, this was manageable. In periods of epidemic, the system collapsed. The cemetery of the Igreja de São Paulo was expanded multiple times throughout the 12th and 13th centuries to accommodate the growing volume of the dead. Modern archaeological excavations have revealed overlapping layers of burials, in some points more than 10 meters deep, compressing centuries of urban mortality into a space that today would be considered small for a residential garden. The architecture of medieval London houses reflected a logic of spatial economy that made every square meter decisive. The typical structure was timber-framed, with oak framing filled with a plaster of straw, clay, and horse manure, a mixture that, when dry, was insulating and durable, but which burned with impressive speed in case of fire. The ground floor often served as a commercial or workspace. The first floor was the main family living room. The second, when there was one, was the dormitory. Family members slept together, often in a single space, with domestic animals, pigs, chickens, sometimes a goat, often accommodated on the same level or just below. This arrangement was not considered degrading, it was functional. The animals provided heat during the winter. Medieval winters in Londres could be severe enough to freeze the Tamisa, and records from the 13th century document at least 3 occasions when fairs were held on the frozen river. Work occupied most of the daylight hours. The workday was not regulated in fixed hours, but in terms of available sunlight, which means it varied dramatically between summer and winter. On the summer solstice, a London artisan could work 16 hours. On the winter solstice, not much more than 8. Candles were expensive and reserved for families with resources. Most activities that required detailed vision, sewing, fine metalwork, calligraphy, stopped with nightfall. This created a seasonal rhythm that permeated not only work, but social life, commerce, and even patterns of conflict recorded in the courts, which show peaks of violent crime in the winter months, when confinement was greater and resources scarcer. The food available in the city was, by medieval standards, surprisingly varied. The Cheapside market was a permanent structure with specialized sections: fishmongers, poulterers, spicers, bakers. Seasonal markets brought producers from the surrounding countryside. There was wheat bread, expensive, reserved for families with means, and rye or oat bread, more affordable and more nutritious than its social prestige suggested. There was fish in abundance, both fresh from the Tamisa and salted or smoked, coming from the northern routes. There were peas, turnips, onions, and leeks, which formed the basis of the diet for the majority of the population. There were spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, that arrived in sufficient quantities to appear in recipes documented in monastic manuscripts intended for common kitchens. Meat was consumed with a frequency that surprises modern researchers. Customs and market records show volumes of protein trade that, distributed by the estimated population, suggest regular weekly consumption among working families. The issue was not the absence of meat. It was access to valued parts. A tannery worker ate viscera and neck. A successful merchant ate loin and ribs. Meat was democratically present, but strictly hierarchical in terms of cut, and yet the city worked. This is the inversion that numbers do not intuitively explain. A city that, by the sanitation standards we would today consider minimally acceptable, should have been unfeasible, was extraordinarily productive and resilient. because medieval Londoners had developed, over generations, practices and immunities that made it possible to live in those conditions. They boiled water before using it, not because they understood microbiology, but because empirical experience had taught them that boiled water made fewer people sick. They drank beer and mead in quantities that today would seem excessive, but which served the function of hydrating with liquids that the fermentation process made relatively safe. The children who survived the first 5 years reached adulthood with an immune system calibrated for that specific environment. The selection was brutal. The survivors were resilient. Seasonality imposed its own restrictions. Advent and Lent were periods of mandatory religious fasting that, in practice, functioned as resource management systems in an age without refrigeration. 40 days of Lent without meat in March and April coincided with the period when winter stocks were at their lowest and new production had not yet reached the market. The liturgical calendar was not just spirituality, it was food logistics disguised as theology. The plague arrived in Londres in November 1348, not abruptly, but as a wave that the ports already sensed coming before the first cases were diagnosed. Ships arriving from Bristol and Southampton brought reports before they brought corpses. And when the corpses began to appear in houses near the river port, the city discovered that none of its structures, religious, medical, administrative, or social, had preparation for what was arriving. Dark buboes appeared in the armpits and along the neck. Fever came in hours. Families disappeared in days. In less than a year, Londres lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its population. The numbers are hard to pin down because the recording system collapsed along with everything else. The priests who were supposed to record the deaths died before completing the records. Grave diggers could not dig individual graves with the speed the bodies demanded. Mass graves were open to the north of the city, an area today called Charterhouse Square, where bodies were deposited in layers with quicklime between them in an attempt to contain the smell and contamination. It is estimated that more than 50,000 people were buried in this single pit between 1348 and 1350. Church bells rang non-stop, and then they stopped because there was no one left to ring them. The city that emerged from the Peste Negra was, in terms of population, a fraction of what it had been, but it was, paradoxically, a wealthier city per inhabitant. The labor shortage that the massive death created irreversibly transformed labor relations. Surviving workers discovered they could negotiate wages previously unthinkable. Serfs who had fled their lords to the cities found employers willing to hire them without asking where they came from, which was technically illegal but practically inevitable given the demographic vacuum. The legislation that the English Parliament passed in response, the Estatuto dos Trabalhadores of 1351, tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It failed. There was not enough coercive force to reverse what biology had created. Death had done what decades of petitions could not, redistributed power. Londres rebuilt itself. It took decades to recover the previous population density. But the city that emerged was structurally different, with less rigid stratification in the guildas, with greater effective social mobility, with a class of artisans and merchants that had acquired real economic power in an environment where the demand for skill exceeded the supply of qualified workers. The Peste Negra did not destroy Londres. It redesigned its social architecture in a way that organic growth never would have produced. And then the smell continued. The streets remained muddy. Animals continued sharing space with families. The Tamisa continued receiving everything the city discarded, because the rupture the plague had caused was social and economic, not sanitary. The understanding that dirt caused disease, that contaminated water killed, that the rat carrying the flea was a vector of destruction, this understanding did not exist. It could not exist. Germ theory was a concept that Europe would not formulate for more than 500 years. What medieval Londres knew was that people died in epidemics. It did not know why. And without the why, there was no way to change the how. The river was the answer to everything and the problem behind everything. It provided water for drinking, fish for eating, a route for trade, power for mills, and a destination for trash. It was impossible to imagine Londres without the Tamisa, and it was impossible to imagine the Tamisa clean while Londres existed in that way. The two systems, the city and the river, had grown together in a symbiosis that was at once productive and lethal. Every commodity that arrived by the river fueled the city's growth. Every person that growth attracted produced more waste. More waste went into the river, and the cycle continued with no internal correction mechanism, without the awareness that there was a limit. What we today call medieval Londres was not a single moment in time. It was a continuous process of adaptation between an expanding population and a physical environment that resisted, absorbed, and eventually returned the impact of that expansion in the forms of epidemic, fire, and periodic infrastructure collapse. The city burned and rebuilt itself, often denser than before. The city fell ill and repopulated, often with migrants from regions who arrived without immunity to local diseases. The city sank in mud and threw cobbles and pottery fragments onto the street floors in attempts to create firmer surfaces, accumulating archaeological layers that today allow us to reconstitute, meter by meter, the rhythm of growth and degradation of this urban organism. Streets that we cross today without thinking keep under the asphalt strata of life that overlap for more than 2,000 years, from the Roman camp to the Saxon village, from the Norman city to the medieval metropolis, each layer compressing the previous one, each generation building on the bones and disposables of the previous generation. The Cidade de Londres, that square kilometre that still maintains boundaries dating back to the Roman walls, is, in the most literal sense possible, an archaeology of decisions accumulated over millennia. When we cross a large modern city and complain about traffic, noise, pollution, and the distance between people, we are experiencing a very attenuated version of a tension that has been constitutive of urban life since the first human clusters surpassed a certain threshold of density. The city has always been this, an environment that maximizes opportunity and exposure simultaneously, that amplifies both wealth and risk, that rewards proximity with productivity and punishes it with disease. Medieval Londres was not a pathological deviation from the human trajectory. It was the human trajectory in its densest and most honest expression. The question that remains is not why people lived that way. It is why we continue to choose the city, in all its forms, with all its costs, generation after generation, century after century, even knowing what that choice implies. Streets full of mud and possibility, air heavy with smell and future. Does that really sound like ancient history, or does it feel uncomfortably familiar? Medieval Londres no longer exists, but the forces that built it, the pull of opportunity, the tolerance for collective risk, the ability to function within conditions that any rational analysis would judge unsustainable. These forces continue operating in every contemporary metropolis. We are the direct heirs of those people who chose the mud, the smell, the density, and the possibility. Anyway, I am Tim, observing the past so that we can understand the present. And together, we keep history being reborn. I'll see you in the next era.